Snow fell in thin, steady flakes over the town square, where a temporary ration station had been set up outside a shuttered bakery during the winter of 1943. The war had reshaped the marketplace into a controlled zone where civilians gathered not to browse goods, but to wait for permission to receive them. Wooden tables stood beneath a canvas awning, and behind them, municipal clerks counted loaves of bread one by one, stacking them in neat rows, as if numbers alone could guarantee fairness. A military guard stood near the entrance to the queue, reminding people that distribution would stop exactly at midday, regardless of how many remained waiting. No one complained aloud. Complaints did not create bread. Instead, civilians focused on the slow forward movement of the line, measuring progress by footsteps rather than minutes. The queue stretched across the cobblestones, past the fountain that no longer carried water, and toward the remains of a tram stop damaged during last year's air raid. Mothers held ration cards inside gloved hands to protect them from melting snow. Elderly men leaned on walking sticks while watching the clerks count loaves, and children stood close to their parents, aware that even one loaf could determine whether soup tasted thin or nourishing that night. Conversations stayed quiet, not because people had nothing to say, but because energy had become something rationed as carefully as food. Among those waiting stood a woman holding a small cloth bag, folded beneath her arm. Her ration booklet showed the creases of repeated use, edges softened by cold air and careful handling. She had arrived early before dawn, hoping that arriving early would mean leaving with bread. But as the line advanced, she noticed the stacks of loaves shrinking faster than expected. The clerks announced numbers occasionally. 30 left, then 22, then 16, each number traveling through the queue, like a ripple across water. When the guard checked the sun's position above the buildings, he reminded everyone that distribution would close regardless of remaining supply. Civilians straightened their posture, calculating their place in line with renewed urgency. No one wanted to step aside for fear of losing position. The woman adjusted her scarf and moved forward with the others, eyes fixed on the bread table where each loaf represented warmth, routine, and survival for one more day. The line moved in small, careful steps as the morning wore on, and each advance felt heavier than the last because everyone could see the bread stacks shrinking behind the clerk's table. The woman shifted her cloth bag from one arm to the other, not out of impatience, but to keep her fingers from stiffening in the cold. Snow continued to fall, settling into the seams of coats and along the edges of ration cards held close to chests. No one stepped out of line for warmth. Leaving even for a moment meant surrendering position, and position could not be reclaimed without argument, which most civilians avoided. War had trained people to accept inconvenience without protest, especially when food was involved. As she moved closer to the counter, the woman could hear the quiet conversations between the clerks. They spoke in numbers and short instructions, reminding each other how many loaves remained and which ration categories still qualified. Occasionally, a civilian was turned away for lacking a proper stamp or for presenting an outdated booklet, and those moments created brief silence in the line. A silence that said everyone understood how easily access could disappear. The woman checked her booklet again, running her finger along the printed entries as if confirming their presence could protect them from being questioned. Behind her, a mother tried to calm a restless child by promising that bread would soon be part of their midday meal. The child asked how much longer, and the mother responded with a vague answer, because exact time no longer existed in ration queues. The people measured waiting not in minutes, but in the number of individuals still ahead of them. The woman counted those ahead carefully, 7, then 5, then 3, and with each reduction, she felt both relief and anxiety. Relief because she was nearing the counter, anxiety because she could not be certain the bread would last until her turn arrived. The guard near the table called out another number, this time with less volume. 9 left. Civilians shifted slightly. absorbing the information in silence. No one accused others of taking too much or moving too slowly. Everyone understood that fairness relied on cooperation. The woman's breath formed small clouds as she stepped forward again, now able to see the loaves clearly. Simple brown bread, not large or decorative, but dense enough to carry a family through another day. When only two people remained ahead of her, she tightened her grip on the booklet. Her arrival at the counter felt inevitable yet fragile, like standing near a door that might close before she reached the handle. She prepared herself for the exchange. Booklet open, stamps visible, voice steady, because even routine procedures required precision in wartime. Bread distribution was not only about hunger. It was about proving one's right to remain part of the civilian order. When the person ahead of her stepped away with their loaf wrapped in paper, the woman moved to the counter with careful respect, placing her ration booklet on the wooden surface as the clerk finished counting the remaining bread. Only a few loaves were left now, lined neatly in a row, their crusts dark from the morning's baking. The clerk did not look at her immediately. He first adjusted the ledger beside him, confirming numbers that had to match exactly before each handover. Rationing had become less about food and more about balance, because imbalance created panic, and panic spread faster than hunger. The woman opened her booklet to the page marked for bread allocation and slid it slightly forward so the stamp could be seen clearly. The clerk took it without speaking and flipped through the entries with quick practice movements. At first, his expression remained neutral, the way most ration officials trained themselves to be. But then his fingers paused on a date written in faded ink. He leaned closer to the booklet, scanning the entry again, and the quiet around the table changed. Civilians waiting behind her sensed that pause immediately, because pauses in ration lines rarely meant something simple. The clerk tapped the page once with his finger. "Missed collection," he said in a low voice that still carried across the table. The woman leaned forward slightly, trying to explain that she had been relocated during that period, that transport delays had prevented her from reaching the ration point on time. But ration counters were not designed for explanations. They were designed for verification. The clerk shook his head, not unkindly but firmly, the way officials did when they felt bound by procedure. He slid the booklet back toward her. "Allocation expired," he added, turning his attention to the next loaf as though the matter had already been settled. The woman's hands did not move at first because the finality of the words felt heavier than expected. She had followed every rule she knew, yet here she was being told that time itself had disqualified her. Behind her, the line remained still. Civilians did not step forward or speak because involvement in someone else's denial risked complicating their own chances. A man, near the middle of the queue, whispered something about fairness and limited supply, and a woman closer to the front murmured that rules had to apply equally. Otherwise, arguments would replace order. No one meant cruelty, they meant survival. In ration culture, no fairness depended on strict boundaries, and boundaries often left someone outside. The woman closed her booklet slowly, pressing the worn cover flat with her palm. She glanced once more at the remaining loaves, calculating how easily one could have fit into her cloth bag, how quietly she would have walked home had the exchange been successful. Instead, she stepped slightly aside, not because she wanted to, but because the clerk had already reached for the next person's card. The cold air seemed sharper now that the possibility of bread had disappeared. She adjusted her scarf again, not to stay warm, but to steady herself. The queue resumed its forward motion as if nothing unusual had happened. In wartime lines, denial did not pause the system. It simply removed one person from it. As the next civilian stepped forward and the clerk resumed distribution, the woman remained near the edge of the counter, ration booklet pressed against her coat as if holding it closer might reverse what had just happened. She did not protest again, because protest rarely changed decisions once a clerk had closed the ledger for a person. Instead, She moved toward the side of the awning where empty crates had been stacked, trying to give the appearance that she had simply finished her transaction rather than been refused. In wartime spaces, appearances mattered, because dignity often depended on how quietly one accepted disappointment. But ration lines were rarely silent for long. A woman near the back, unaware of the exact details, asked another civilian why someone would be denied bread when supply still remained. The response came quickly. Mr. Turn, followed by a shrug that implied consequence more than judgment. Within minutes, the explanation evolved, as such explanations often did. Someone suggested she might have traded her previous ration for something else. Another speculated that she might not belong to the district anymore. These were not accusations spoken loudly. They were observations passed between people trying to understand a system that affected them all. The woman kept her gaze lowered, watching footprints gather snow, rather than meeting anyone's eyes. She had learned that eye contact sometimes invited questions, and questions in ration queues could become arguments that served no one. Still, the distance created by her silence did not protect her from becoming a topic of conversation. A man near the bread table remarked that rules had tightened because of recent shortages, implying that leniency would encourage dishonesty. Others nodded, not out of cruelty, but because agreement felt safer than uncertainty. A child near the queue tugged at their mother's sleeve and asked why the woman did not receive bread like the others. The mother hesitated before replying that sometimes people arrived too late or did not follow instructions. The answer was simple enough for a child, yet it carried an unintended weight, transforming a missed collection into a lesson about responsibility. The woman heard this explanation and felt a quiet heaviness settle in her chest, not because she rejected the idea of rules, but because she knew circumstances had moved beyond her control when she missed that earlier date. She considered leaving the square altogether, but leaving too quickly might suggest guilt, and staying too long invited speculation. So she remained near the crates, adjusting her scarf, pretending to organize the items inside her cloth bag, even though there was nothing inside it. Snow gathered along the edges of the awning, and the cold seemed more noticeable now that she no longer anticipated warmth from bread. Meanwhile, the clerks announced the final number of loaves remaining, and civilians responded with silent calculations about their own chances. No one approached the woman to comfort her. Ration queues were not designed for emotional exchanges. Survival had trained people to focus forward rather than sideways. Yet, even in that forward motion, a few glances returned to her position near the crates, reminders that denial rarely disappeared from collective memory once it occurred. A few steps away from the ration tables, an American lieutenant stood reviewing distribution notes with a municipal officer assigned to oversee supply accuracy. His task that morning had been straightforward: confirm that bread deliveries matched the numbers recorded for civilian allocation. These inspections had become routine, part of a broader effort to maintain order in areas where shortages easily created unrest. He had arrived earlier with a small escort and had remained mostly silent, observing the exchange between clerks and civilians, without interfering unless regulations were misunderstood. From his position near the ledger stand, the lieutenant had seen the woman move from the queue to the side of the awning. At first, he assumed she had completed her collection and stepped aside to adjust her belongings. But the longer she remained there without bread in hand, the more his attention shifted. Experience had taught him that civilians rarely lingered near ration counters after successful transactions. They usually left quickly to secure their provisions. Her stillness suggested something else. He asked the municipal officer whether any denials had occurred during the morning distribution. The officer replied that only one civilian had been turned away due to a missed collection date, adding that such cases were unfortunate but necessary to maintain fairness. The lieutenant nodded, though he continued watching the woman by the crates. Fairness, he knew, often depended on context rather than strict interpretation, especially in regions where displacement had disrupted normal schedules. When the line shortened further, the lieutenant stepped closer to the bread table under the pretense of verifying the remaining count. He listened quietly as the clerk explained the allocation process to the next civilian. The explanation was clear and consistent with regulation, yet the lieutenant noticed that the clerk's tone had softened compared to the earlier exchange he had observed from afar. Perhaps the clerk had also felt the weight of that denial. As the final loaves were distributed, the lieutenant turned his attention back to the woman. She stood with her ration booklet tucked beneath her arm, watching the process without expectation. Her posture did not reflect anger or desperation, only a measured acceptance that seemed too calm for the situation. Such composure often appeared among civilians who had endured multiple disruptions, yet they learned that emotional responses rarely changed outcomes. The lieutenant considered the regulations in place. Missed collections typically resulted in forfeited portions, but exceptions existed for individuals displaced due to curfews, transport delays, or shelter relocation. These exceptions were rarely invoked because they required additional documentation and verification. Yet, they remained part of the system precisely for cases where rigid enforcement conflicted with fairness. He asked the municipal officer whether the woman had provided any explanation for her absence on the previous collection date. The officer admitted that the conversation had been brief due to the line's length and that further details had not been recorded. The lieutenant exhaled slowly, recognizing that ration counters were designed for efficiency rather than investigation. Snow continued to fall lightly across the square as civilians began dispersing with their provisions. The woman remained near the crates, neither approaching the clerk again nor leaving the area. The lieutenant understood that her hesitation likely stemmed from uncertainty about what options remained. Regulations did not always reveal themselves clearly to those affected by them. After a moment's thought, the lieutenant adjusted his gloves and stepped toward the woman, not with urgency, but with the deliberate pace of someone seeking clarification rather than confrontation. His intention was not to override procedure, but to ensure it had been applied with all relevant considerations in mind. The lieutenant approached without drawing attention, careful not to create a scene that might embarrass the woman further. Ration squares had their own kind of etiquette, and public correction of clerks often caused more discomfort than resolution. He stopped a respectful distance from her and spoke in a calm, low voice, asking whether he could see her ration booklet. The woman looked up with a mix of hesitation and relief, unsure whether the request signaled help or another review that might confirm her loss. Still, she handed him the booklet without delay, as civilians had learned that hesitation sometimes appeared suspicious in administrative spaces. He opened the booklet and located the bread allocation page. The missed collection date was marked clearly, but so was a municipal relocation stamp issued during the same period. The lieutenant recognized the stamp immediately. It had been used for civilians temporarily reassigned to different housing sectors due to overcrowding and curfew restrictions. Such relocations often disrupted regular ration schedules, a reality acknowledged in supply guidelines but not always remembered by clerks working under pressure. The lieutenant returned to the bread table and placed the booklet gently beside the ledger. He asked the clerk whether relocation stamps had been reviewed before making the denial. The clerk, slightly flustered by the question, admitted that the morning's pace had made it difficult to examine each case in depth. He explained that the missed date automatically triggered forfeiture unless additional authorization was presented at the time of collection. The lieutenant nodded, understanding the challenge faced by distribution staff, yet also aware that regulations allowed flexibility when displacement could be verified. Instead of ordering the clerk to reverse the decision, the lieutenant chose a different approach, one that maintained procedural respect while addressing the woman's need. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small envelope containing his personal allowance for local purchases. Soldiers often used these allowances for small goods when regulations permitted. He placed the necessary amount on the table and asked whether the bread could be issued as a paid civilian portion, separate from ration allocation. The clerk hesitated only briefly before agreeing, recognizing that such transactions were permissible and did not disrupt the ledger's balance. The exchange was quiet enough that most civilians had already turned away from the square, unaware that the outcome had changed. The clerk wrapped one of the remaining loaves in paper and slid it across the table. The lieutenant picked it up and handed it directly to the woman, not with ceremony, but with the same practicality used for routine distributions. His gesture communicated that the bread was hers, without suggesting that charity had replaced regulation. The woman accepted the loaf carefully, fingers pressing into the warm crust, as if confirming it was real. She thanked him in a voice that carried both gratitude and restraint, aware that prolonged expressions might attract attention. The lieutenant simply nodded, returning the booklet to her and reminding her to present the relocation stamp during future collections. Snow continued to fall as the square gradually emptied. The intervention had not altered policy or created exception records. It had simply ensured that fairness found a practical path within existing rules. In wartime, such solutions often preserved dignity more effectively than formal reversals. The woman held the wrapped loaf close to her chest for a moment before placing it carefully into her cloth bag, making sure the paper remained sealed so the warmth would last a little longer. The action itself was simple, yet it carried a quiet weight because it reversed what the crowd had already accepted as final. A few civilians who had lingered near the fountain noticed the exchange and glanced toward the counter again, their expressions shifting from assumption to reconsideration. No one spoke, but silence itself had a language. It acknowledged that the earlier conclusion about her situation had been incomplete. The clerk adjusted the ledger once more, adding a brief note beside the final transaction to indicate a paid civilian portion. His movements were calm now, the earlier tension replaced by relief that the morning's count remained balanced. He closed the book with a soft thud and began stacking empty trays, signaling that distribution had officially ended. The municipal officer nearby nodded toward the lieutenant in appreciation for maintaining order without creating conflict. Wartime administration relied heavily on cooperation between roles, and when that cooperation succeeded quietly, it often went unnoticed by the public. The woman stepped away from the awning, not hurriedly, but with a steadiness that suggested her earlier uncertainty had eased. Snow gathered lightly on her shoulders as she moved toward the edge of the square. She passed the same civilians who had whispered earlier, and while none offered apologies, their glances now carried a different tone. Less judgment, but more acknowledgement. In ration communities, reputation could change quickly when facts became visible. The woman did not seek recognition. Simply walking forward without hesitation was enough. Behind her, the lieutenant remained near the bread table, discussing future delivery schedules with the municipal officer. His attention had already returned to logistics, yet the moment lingered in the air, because it demonstrated how regulations could coexist with compassion when applied thoughtfully. Civilians often viewed officials as distant figures, bound by rigid rules. But this exchange revealed another possibility. Authority used not to dominate, but to clarify. The woman reached the edge of the square where the tram tracks disappeared beneath snow. She paused briefly, adjusting the cloth bag so the loaf rested securely against her side. In the scent of fresh bread rose faintly through the paper, a reminder that warmth could still exist within systems shaped by scarcity. She did not look back toward the counter because looking back would have returned her to the earlier moment of denial. Instead, she continued forward, footsteps steady, aware that the rest of the day would unfold with greater ease now that one essential need had been met. In wartime towns, such moments rarely drew attention beyond the immediate participants, yet they shaped how communities perceived fairness. The recognition she received was not applause or public praise. It was the restoration of her place within the line of civilians who relied on shared rules for survival. That restoration allowed her to move forward not as someone who had been refused, but as someone who had been acknowledged. The woman walked slowly away from the square, not because she was tired, but because the moment required a slower pace to settle into her thoughts. The bread inside her cloth bag felt heavier than its actual weight, carrying more than food. It carried the proof that she still belonged within the system that had seemed to close around her only minutes earlier. Snow continued to fall across the rooftops and tram lines, softening the sharp edges of buildings damaged by earlier air raids. In winter, even destruction looked quieter, as if the season itself asked people to pause their worries for a few moments. She passed a row of boarded windows where shopkeepers had once displayed goods before shortages turned glass into wood and signs into chalk markings. A small group of civilians walked ahead of her, their own ration parcels tucked close to their coats. No one rushed now. Distribution hours were over, and the pressure of securing food for the day had eased. Conversations remained low and careful, shaped by the shared understanding that tomorrow would bring another queue, another calculation of supply and patience. As she reached the narrow street leading toward her lodging, the woman paused near a doorway to adjust her scarf. The scent of bread rose again from the bag, and she allowed herself a single, steady breath, recognizing how rare such simple comforts had become. Hunger had taught civilians to appreciate small certainties, and today that certainty had returned through a path she had not expected. She did not think about the clerk's refusal anymore. She thought instead about how easily misunderstanding could shape outcomes in places governed by numbers and stamps. Back at the square, municipal workers began folding the canvas awning and stacking empty crates. The lieutenant completed his inspection notes and handed them to the officer responsible for delivery schedules. Their discussion focused on quantities, routes, and the timing of the next shipment. The morning's events did not appear in official reports. They existed only in memory, which often carried the quieter truths of wartime more accurately than ledgers. The woman resumed walking, passing a family gathered near a doorway, where a mother divided bread into careful portions for her children. The scene reminded her that survival depended not only on regulations, but also on the ways communities learned to adapt to them. She wondered how many others had faced similar moments of uncertainty, and how often fairness required someone to pause long enough to see beyond routine. When she finally reached the steps of her lodging, she brushed snow from her coat and opened the door quietly so as not to disturb others inside. Warmth from a small stove greeted her, and she placed the bread on a shared table before removing her gloves. The room carried the familiar sounds of civilian life continuing despite conflict. Soft voices, careful laughter, and the movement of chairs across worn floors. The war outside had not changed. Supplies would remain limited. Lines would form again, and decisions would continue to be made quickly at counters across the region. Yet within these routines, moments of balance still appeared. The woman understood that dignity during wartime was not found in grand gestures, but in the small corrections that allowed people to remain part of their communities. She sat near the stove for a while, letting warmth reach her hands, aware that tomorrow would begin another cycle of waiting and patience. For now, the bread on the table and the quiet around her were enough.